A lot of people think neighbor disputes start with loud music, barking dogs, or somebody parking where they shouldn't. Mine started with 6 oak trees and a man who thought property lines were more of a suggestion than an actual boundary. Looking back now, it's almost funny, almost. Because by the time everything was over, that man lost tens of thousands of dollars. His dream house flip turned into a financial nightmare. And all because he couldn't keep his hands off something that didn't belong to him. The crazy part is that none of it had to happen. If he had simply knocked on my door and had a normal conversation like a reasonable adult, we'd probably still wave at each other today. Instead, he decided he knew better. My name is Ethan, and at the time this happened, I'd been living in the same house for nearly 12 years. It wasn't some fancy mansion or luxury property, just a comfortable suburban home with a backyard I genuinely loved. The best feature of that yard wasn't the patio, the garden, or even the workshop I'd built in the corner. It was the row of 6 massive oak trees running along the property line. Those trees had been there longer than either me or the previous owners. Every summer they created a thick canopy of shade that covered almost half the backyard. They kept the place cool during brutal heat waves, gave the yard privacy, and honestly made the entire property feel peaceful. They were the kind of mature trees people pay a premium for when buying a home. Then in early spring, everything changed. The house next door sold. A new family moved in. The husband was named Brandon. His wife seemed nice enough. They had 2 young kids. For the first couple of weeks, everything seemed normal. We exchanged greetings, talked briefly over the fence. Nothing unusual. Then around mid-April, I noticed something that immediately felt wrong. I was mowing my lawn when I glanced toward the property line and saw sunlight coming through areas that had always been shaded. At first I thought maybe I was imagining it. Then I walked closer. That's when my stomach dropped. Several branches were missing from my oak trees. Not broken, not storm damaged, not naturally fallen. Cut. Clean cuts. Fresh cuts. Somebody had deliberately removed them. I started walking the entire fence line. The more I looked, the worse it got. There weren't just 1 or 2 missing branches. There were dozens. Some of them were thick enough that nobody could have removed them without using a chainsaw. And what really made my blood pressure rise was the location of the cuts. Some branches had been removed from Brandon's side of the property line, but several had clearly been cut from my side. My property. My trees. My responsibility. I stood there staring at those exposed cuts, feeling that strange combination of anger and disbelief that only comes when somebody violates a boundary and acts like it means nothing. Still, I wanted to be reasonable. I didn't storm over there yelling. I didn't threaten anybody. I simply walked next door and knocked. Brandon answered. I asked him directly, "Hey, did you cut branches off my oak trees?" He didn't hesitate, didn't deny it, didn't even look embarrassed. "Yeah," he said. "They were blocking sunlight in our yard." Just like that. Like he was telling me he borrowed a garden hose. I explained that those were my trees, and he couldn't just cut parts of them without permission. He immediately crossed his arms and said, "Anything hanging over my property is fair game." Now, technically, there was a tiny piece of truth buried inside what he was saying. Homeowners can often trim branches that extend onto their side of a property line, but that's where the truth ended. I told him several branches had been cut well inside my property. He shrugged, actually shrugged. Then he said something I'll never forget. "It's the same tree. What's the difference?" That sentence told me everything I needed to know about who I was dealing with. To him, ownership didn't matter. Boundaries didn't matter. Rules only mattered when they benefited him. I told him the difference was that he had damaged somebody else's property without permission. His response was a smirk. "They're just trees. They'll grow back." Then he closed the door in my face. Just like that. Conversation over. No apology. No accountability. Nothing. I stood on his front porch for a few seconds trying to process what had just happened. Part of me wanted to believe he was simply ignorant. Maybe he genuinely didn't understand tree law. Maybe he thought he was right. But another part of me recognized something deeper. There are people who make mistakes, and then there are people who assume everyone else has to live with the consequences of their mistakes. Brandon felt like the second type. The next morning I called a certified arborist. If someone was going to tell me whether real damage had been done, I wanted an expert. What he told me changed everything. After inspecting all 6 trees, he looked at me and shook his head. He pointed out improper cuts, cuts made too close to the trunk, cuts that violated basic tree care practices. He explained how poor trimming creates entry points for disease, insects, and decay. One tree in particular had several major limbs removed in a way that could permanently affect its health. Then he gave me an estimate. If treatment became necessary, and especially if any of the trees declined or died, the damages could easily reach several $1,000s. Suddenly, this wasn't about a rude neighbor anymore. This was property damage. Real property damage. So I did what any reasonable homeowner should do. I documented everything. Photos, measurements, written reports. Then I drafted a professional letter. No threats, no insults, just facts. I included the arborist's findings, explained the damage, requested reimbursement for potential treatment costs, and politely asked him to stop touching my trees in the future. I honestly thought that would be the end of it. A rational person sees documentation from a professional, realizes they've made a mistake, and backs off. But Brandon wasn't interested in backing off. In fact, he was just getting started. Now before I tell you what happened next, let me pause for a second because this is where a lot of homeowners accidentally make things worse. According to standard procedure, when somebody damages a tree near a property line, your first instinct might be to retaliate. Maybe cut something of theirs. Maybe start a screaming match across the fence. That's exactly what you should not do. From a legal perspective, trees are often considered part of the property's measurable value, especially mature trees. In some areas, damaging a protected tree can trigger fines that are far more expensive than people realize. What fascinated me most, though, was Brandon's mindset. This is a psychological trap many people fall into when they buy a new home. They start viewing everything around them through the lens of convenience. If a tree blocks sunlight, the tree becomes the problem. If a neighbor objects, the neighbor becomes the problem. They never stop to ask whether their own actions created the conflict. The lesson here is that entitlement tends to escalate when it goes unchallenged. The first time someone gets away with crossing a boundary, they often convince themselves they were right all along. And unfortunately for Brandon, he was about to learn that property law doesn't care about personal opinions. 2 weeks passed after I mailed that letter. No response. No phone call. No email. No note on my door. Nothing. Honestly, the silence didn't surprise me. Brandon had already shown me exactly how he handled conflict. If acknowledging a problem required admitting fault, he'd simply pretend the problem didn't exist. So I focused on my own life and hoped he'd gotten the message. Then one Saturday morning around 7:30, I woke up to a sound every homeowner recognizes instantly. A chainsaw. At first I thought maybe somebody in the neighborhood was doing yard work. Then I realized the noise was coming from directly outside my bedroom window. I jumped out of bed, looked through the blinds, and immediately felt my stomach twist. Brandon was standing near the property line with a chainsaw in his hands. Wood chips were flying. One of my oak trees had already been cut. I threw on a shirt and rushed outside. By the time I reached the fence, the damage was done. He hadn't just trimmed branches this time. He had topped the tree. If you're not familiar with topping, imagine taking a beautiful mature tree and essentially chopping off the top section of its crown. It destroys the natural structure, weakens the tree, and often creates long-term health problems. The tree looked mutilated. Years of growth gone in a single morning. "What the hell are you doing?" I yelled. Brandon shut off the chainsaw and looked at me with that same irritating confidence I'd seen before. "Improving my view," he said. Improving his view. Like he was talking about rearranging furniture. I reminded him that I'd already sent a professional report documenting the damage. I reminded him that the trees were on my property. I reminded him that touching them again was a terrible idea. He laughed. Actually laughed. Then he said, "You don't own the sunlight." I remember standing there wondering how somebody could be so aggressively stupid. Because at that point this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was deliberate. He knew I objected. He knew the trees weren't his. He simply didn't care. That afternoon I called the arborist again. He inspected the newly damaged tree and looked even more concerned than before. He explained that topping is considered one of the worst practices in modern arboriculture. The stress can trigger decay, insect infestations, structural weakness, and in some cases eventual death. The estimated damages increased substantially. That's when I stopped trying to convince Brandon to behave reasonably. Instead, I started asking a different question. What mattered to him? People rarely fear consequences they don't understand. But everybody has a pressure point. I spent a little time researching him online. Nothing invasive. Just public information. That's when I found his professional profile. Brandon worked in residential real estate development. More importantly, he specialized in buying properties, renovating them, and selling them for profit. Suddenly, everything clicked. The obsession with sunlight. The obsession with appearance. The impatience. He wasn't planning to live there long term. The house wasn't a home. It was an investment project. And if there's one thing investors care about, it's property value. I wasn't interested in revenge. I wasn't going to vandalize anything or harass anybody. But I was absolutely interested in accountability. So I started digging into local regulations. The first thing I discovered surprised me. Several of my oak trees qualified as protected trees under municipal code because of their age and trunk diameter. That meant significant trimming required permits and oversight. Even property owners couldn't simply hack away at them whenever they felt like it. Brandon hadn't applied for any permits. He hadn't consulted anybody. He had just started cutting. So I compiled everything. Photographs, property surveys, the arborist reports, dates, timelines, documentation. Then I filed a formal complaint with the city. A few weeks later, code enforcement arrived. The inspection didn't take long. The evidence was obvious. Measurements confirmed the protected status of the trees. Records confirmed no permits had been issued. Brandon was cited and fined. The amount wasn't life-changing, but it was enough to get his attention. For the first time, somebody with actual authority was telling him he was wrong. Most people would have taken that as a warning. Most people would have realized they needed to be careful. Brandon wasn't most people. While all that was happening, I kept researching. The more I learned about the property, the more interesting things became. Public records revealed a series of renovations completed before Brandon purchased the house. A large elevated deck, a finished basement, additional electrical work, plumbing modifications. At first I didn't think much about it. Then I started comparing permit records. Something didn't add up. The improvements existed physically, but permits appeared to be missing. I double-checked, then triple-checked. Still nothing. That raised a serious question. Had those projects ever been approved? I submitted an inquiry. A building inspector eventually reviewed the situation. What happened next felt almost unreal. The inspection uncovered multiple issues. Some electrical work failed code requirements. Portions of the plumbing system had been modified without approval. The deck didn't meet current structural standards. Basement emergency egress requirements weren't satisfied. One issue led to another, and another, and another. Suddenly, Brandon wasn't dealing with a tree dispute anymore. He was dealing with a property compliance nightmare. The timing couldn't have been worse for him because the housing market had cooled slightly, and he was approaching the point where he'd want to list the property. Except now he couldn't simply put it on the market and walk away. Before selling, the violations needed to be addressed. Contractors were hired. Permits were pulled. Sections of work had to be removed and rebuilt. Inspections followed inspections. Every time I saw another contractor truck parked outside, I knew the meter was still running. Tens of thousands of dollars started disappearing into repairs that never should have existed in the first place. Some people later asked whether I felt guilty. The answer is no, not even a little. I didn't create those violations. I didn't build the deck. I didn't install unapproved electrical systems. I didn't ignore permit requirements. All I did was report facts. The city made the decisions. The inspectors made the findings. The consequences belonged to the people responsible. Meanwhile, I still had the issue of my trees. The arborist reports documented measurable damages, and I wasn't interested in absorbing those costs myself. So I filed a claim in small claims court. By then my documentation was extensive. Every photograph was organized. Every report was labeled. Every interaction had been recorded in writing. When the hearing date arrived, I walked into court carrying a binder thick enough to make a tax accountant smile. Brandon showed up looking exhausted. Months of fines, repairs, inspections, and delays had clearly taken a toll. During the hearing, the judge reviewed the evidence carefully. The photographs spoke for themselves. The arborist's professional opinions were detailed and consistent. The timeline demonstrated repeated actions after being warned. That detail mattered. A mistake is one thing. Continuing after notice is something else entirely. Brandon tried arguing that the branches affected his enjoyment of his property. The judge didn't seem impressed. Property rights don't disappear because somebody finds a tree inconvenient. After reviewing everything, the court ruled in my favor. I didn't receive the full amount I requested, but the judgment was substantial. Thousands of dollars. Enough to cover damages and reinforce a very important principle. Actions have consequences. When I walked out of that courthouse, I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't pumping my fist or calling friends. Mostly I felt relieved. The conflict had consumed months of my life. I wanted it finished. Eventually, autumn arrived. The contractors disappeared. The inspectors stopped showing up. The endless activity next door finally slowed down. Then the listing appeared. Brandon's house officially hit the market. I remember seeing the sign in the yard and wondering whether the entire project had been worth it. Between fines, repairs, permit corrections, legal expenses, delays, and the court judgment, the numbers had to be ugly. A few months later, the property sold. Public records eventually revealed what many of us suspected. The final sale price barely exceeded what he'd originally paid. The profit margin he had envisioned when he bought the house had effectively evaporated. After all the stress, all the conflict, all the shortcuts and arrogance, he walked away with almost nothing. And the thing that still makes me shake my head is how preventable the entire situation was. This wasn't a story about bad luck. It wasn't a story about an unfair system. It was the story of a man who believed rules existed for other people until those same rules showed up at his front door one inspection at a time. When people hear this story, they usually focus on the ending. They focus on the fines, the inspections, the lawsuit, the repairs, and the money Brandon ultimately lost. That's understandable because those are the dramatic parts. Those are the moments that feel satisfying when you're listening from the outside. But honestly, that's not the part one think about most when I look back on everything. What stays with me is how unnecessary the entire conflict was. 6 mature oak trees had stood peacefully along that property line for decades. They survived storms, droughts, previous owners, and changing neighborhoods. The only thing they couldn't survive was a person who believed his preferences mattered more than everyone else's rights. That's something I see more and more these days. People convince themselves that being inconvenienced automatically makes them the victim. They don't ask permission. They don't start conversations. They don't look for compromise. They simply decide what outcome they want, and then act as if everyone else is required to accept it. This is a psychological trap that shows up in neighborhoods, workplaces, families, and even friendships. Once someone starts believing that their frustration justifies their behavior, they stop seeing boundaries clearly. They stop asking, "Am I allowed to do this?" and start asking, "Can I get away with this?" That's a dangerous shift because it usually leads to bigger and bigger mistakes. According to standard procedure, most property disputes can be resolved long before lawyers, inspectors, or judges become involved. A simple conversation often prevents thousands of dollars in damage. The irony is that Brandon could have knocked on my door the day he moved in and said, "Hey, these branches are blocking a lot of sunlight. Do you think we can figure something out?" If he had done that, I probably would have hired a professional to selectively trim portions of the canopy myself. We might have split costs. We might have found a solution that benefited both properties. Instead, he chose entitlement over communication. From a legal perspective, one of the biggest mistakes homeowners make is assuming ownership rights are flexible when they become inconvenient. They aren't. Property lines exist for a reason. Permits exist for a reason. Environmental protections exist for a reason. You don't have to agree with every regulation, but ignoring them rarely ends well. The system may move slowly, but when enough documentation starts piling up, consequences tend to arrive eventually. The lesson here is that accountability often looks boring at first. It's paperwork, photos, reports, emails, official complaints. People expect justice to arrive dramatically, like a scene from a movie. In reality, it usually arrives through patience and documentation. One form, one inspection, one ruling at a time. That's exactly what happened here. I didn't damage his property. I didn't scream across the fence. I didn't try to get revenge. I simply followed the process and allowed the process to do what it was designed to do. Looking back, I actually feel a little sorry for Brandon. Not because of the money he lost, but because of the mindset that caused him to lose it. Imagine how much easier life would be if you didn't spend every day fighting battles you created yourself. Imagine how much stress, time, and frustration could be avoided by respecting other people's boundaries from the beginning. In the end, the oak trees are still standing. A few needed treatment, one never fully recovered its original shape, but most of them continue to provide shade every summer. They outlasted the dispute, the inspections, the lawsuit, and even the neighbor who started it all. And maybe that's the funniest part. Brandon thought the trees were the obstacle standing in the way of his success. Turns out the real obstacle was staring back at him every morning in the mirror. So now I'm curious what you think. If your neighbor had repeatedly cut and damaged your trees after being warned, would you have handled it the same way, or would you have taken a different approach? Let me know in the comments. And if you've ever dealt with a nightmare neighbor who thought the rules didn't apply to them, I'd love to hear that story too. Trust me, after this experience, very little surprises me anymore.